They said no woman ever ran from Bellhaven Plantation. Not once in 40 years. Not in the heat of summer when the cane fields blistered skin. Not in the cold of winter when the hounds slept light. Bellhaven had no runaway slaves, and to outsiders that was its legend, its strange point of pride. But those who lived behind its iron gates whispered another story, one that never left the rows. The land itself felt wrong. The soil was dark, too rich, as if soaked with more than rain. Every morning before sunrise, the women were marched past the same locked shed, the one sunk into the earth with a rusted chain bolted across its doors. No one asked what was inside. No one dared to. The overseer, Mr. Crail, had a saying, "Curiosity gets you planted." And everyone understood that planted meant something more permanent than burial. But in the summer of 1843, something began to change. The night birds went silent. The air smelled different, like wet copper and rot. The younger women started waking in the dark, hearing a low knocking from beneath the floorboards of the sleeping quarters, like fists pounding from underground. One girl, barely 16, swore she saw a pale hand reach through the cracks of the earth near the smokehouse. She told the cook, who told the midwife, who told no one else. By morning the girl was gone, her bed stripped clean, her name struck from the roll. That week Master Bellhaven himself returned from New Orleans with new men, new locks and new rules. No woman was to speak after dusk. The fields would be worked under lamplight, and the shed, the root cellar as he called it, would remain sealed. What no one understood then was that Bellhaven's silence was not loyalty. It was terror, bred into bone and forced by something buried deep beneath the land, something that had begun to wake. When Master Elias Bellhaven returned that summer, he brought with him a stench of sickness and new money. The wagons behind him carried iron tools that no one recognized, hooks, clamps, long rods with screw handles, and a chest locked with 3 keys. The house servants said he'd been to a physician in New Orleans, a man who studied the improvement of Negro stock. The word sounded like scripture to the men, but to the women they felt like an omen. Bellhaven was not an ordinary plantation. It was remote, fenced with swamp and cypress. Its isolation meant no patrols came through, no preachers passed by, and no trader ever asked too many questions. The master liked it that way. He kept ledgers no one saw and journals written in cipher, stored in the study where the shutters never opened. That summer, the women noticed a change in the night routine. The lanterns outside the quarters were lit until dawn. Overseer Crail patrolled with a musket and dogs, though no one had ever tried to flee. And under the sound of the crickets there came the hammering again, from deep beneath the shed. The cook said it was the sound of workmen. The midwife said it was the sound of the devil. And the old field hand Jonah said he'd seen it once before, years ago, when the cellar doors were still new and the ground still clean. He told the women to keep their heads down and their mouths shut, because Bellhaven soil was hungry. Then came the first of the disappearances. A woman named Rue, young, quiet, newly sold from a neighboring farm. One night she was there. The next morning her cot was gone, her name scratched out from the ledger. The overseer said she'd been relocated, but the others knew better. They'd seen the master's boots at the shed that night, muddy, streaked with red clay and something darker, and by dawn, the knocking from underground had stopped. After Rue vanished, the air in the quarters thickened with dread. The women whispered less, prayed more, and worked until their palms bled. Yet every night when the lamps were extinguished, the same sound returned, a faint pulsing rhythm beneath the ground. It wasn't hammering anymore. It was slower, deeper, almost human, like a heartbeat trapped in the soil. The overseer dismissed their fears as superstition. But one night when the rain came hard and the hounds wouldn't stop howling, the midwife, Aunt Cora, went to see for herself. She was old enough to remember the first generation of slaves brought to Bellhaven, old enough to have seen how the master buried his secrets, She crept behind the sugar barn with a candle stub and pressed her ear to the boards of the shed. What she heard made her drop the light, breathing slow, ragged, but certain, and beneath it the faint clatter of metal chains. Someone or something was alive down there. By morning, Aunt Cora's hair had turned white at the roots. She refused to speak for 2 days. When she finally did, she told the women to keep the children close and never touch the cellar door. "That place," she whispered, "ain't for the dead nor the living." The master began sleeping in the library away from his wife. Servants said they could hear him talking through the night, muttering about generation, blood, and perfect stock. Some swore they saw new wagons arriving before dawn, covered, silent, guarded, and then the pattern began again. Another woman gone. Another cot stripped bare. The field hands started marking days by disappearances instead of harvest. And late one night, one of the boys cleaning the tool shed found a strange marking carved into the floor. A circle made of 7 intersecting lines. The same symbol burned into the underside of the master's ring. That was when the women realized the cellar wasn't just a prison. It was a womb. The women began to move like shadows, silent, coordinated, invisible to the overseer's eye. They spoke through gestures, through the rhythm of the washboard and the passing of pails. It was Mira, the blacksmith's wife, who first dared to lift the chain from the cellar door. It was heavier than she expected and warm, as though it held a pulse of its own. Inside, the air was so thick with moisture it felt like stepping into lungs. The torchlight quivered against the walls, revealing not stone but flesh-colored plaster veined and wet. The floor sloped downward into darkness where the smell of iron, blood, and rust mingled with something sweet and rotten, like spoiled milk. They descended only a few steps before Mira froze. There were cribs, small, crude, made from rough wood. In each something was wrapped in cloth, too small to be human, too still to be alive. One bundle twitched. She bit down on her scream. Behind the crib stood glass jars stacked to the ceiling, filled with cloudy liquid in shapes she couldn't name. Some had limbs, others had faces pressed against the glass, mouths open as if mid-scream. And at the far end of the chamber, a table, leather straps, stains that were not yet dry. Before she could move, a sound rose from beneath the table, a low, dragging inhale, followed by a gurgled sigh. Something was breathing through the floor. Mira turned to flee, but her foot struck metal, a thin pipe running from the ceiling down into the soil. She followed it with her eyes and saw where it led, the cribs. Whatever was buried down there was feeding the room above. Mira fled into the night, the stench clinging to her skin. She told no one, not even Aunt Cora, but her silence carried more terror than any words could. From that night on, she refused to eat, to speak, or to sleep indoors. By the next full moon, Mira was gone too. After Mira vanished, something in Bellhaven shifted. The dog stopped barking at night. The overseer stopped patrolling. Even the air hung still, as if the land itself were holding its breath. But the women could feel it, and that quiet wasn't peace. It was waiting. Aunt Cora began to see patterns. The disappearances always followed the same nights, after the master's private gatherings, when the main house filled with strange men who arrived under moonlight and left before dawn. They never spoke to the slaves, never looked at them. They went straight to the cellar, carrying crates that dripped with something dark. One evening, when the men came early, Cora hid behind the smokehouse and watched. The master opened the shed with his ring pressed into the lock and a light spilled out. Not firelight, but something blue and trembling, like lanterns under water. He whispered words she couldn't understand, syllables that made her teeth ache. And then she heard it, crying. A woman's voice, weak and distant, echoing from beneath the ground. The next morning she gathered the others. If no one spoke, no one would survive. They began digging behind the quarters, far enough from the main house that the overseer wouldn't see. After 3 nights, their shovel struck something solid. It wasn't stone. It was bone. A wall made entirely of it, white and smooth, stretching under the field like the foundation of another house. Embedded in the ribs were small metal plaques stamped with numbers. BC1, BC2, BC3. The women didn't know what it meant then, but the initials were carved into the master's ledgers too. BC. Breeding cell. Each number matched a name that no longer existed in Bellhaven's rolls. They had uncovered the graves of those who never ran. Aunt Cora dropped her shovel and said only one thing. The master ain't making slaves down there. He's making mothers. And for the first time in Bellhaven's history, someone whispered the word escape. After the wall of bone was found, the women's fear hardened into a quiet purpose. They didn't speak of escape anymore. They spoke of evidence, of proof. If Bellhaven was to be destroyed, the world had to know what had been buried beneath it. Aunt Cora remembered the journals locked inside the master's study. The ledgers he never let the overseer touch. On the third night after the last disappearance, she sent the youngest housegirl, Liddy, through the window while the master slept off his brandy. The child returned with 3 books bound in red leather and a scrap of parchment folded into 4 squares. The books were written in a surgeon's hand, neat, clinical, cold. Each entry listed dates, numbers, and short phrases. Series B, viability low. Subject 14 terminated. Cross-strain unresponsive. The parchment carried a diagram, a crude map of the plantation. At its center was a circle marked Root Cellar, BC Station. Radiating outward were arrows toward the quarters, each labeled donor line. The truth struck like fever. The master had been conducting experiments, not rituals. His obsession wasn't with spirits, but with control, with breeding a lineage immune to labor, sickness, and rebellion. A human project built on generations of exploitation, disguised as husbandry. Cora's hands trembled as she turned the pages. At the bottom of one ledger was a single line written differently from the rest. When the mothers fail, the soil remembers. She understood then that the ground itself, the strange fertility of Bellhaven's crops, the rich black earth was fed not by miracle but by decay. Every buried experiment had rotted into the soil, seeding it with something neither dead nor living. By dawn, Cora hid the ledgers beneath the chapel floorboards. The others knew they couldn't destroy Bellhaven by fire. The master would rebuild. But truth could outlast him. And as the sun rose over the silent fields, the air seemed to whisper, not with pain, but with memory. The ledgers changed everything, yet nothing changed at all. No chains were loosened, no mercy appeared, the field still filled before dawn. The whip still sang through the air, and the master still walked among the rows as if the world were untouched. But the silence became a sickness. It moved from person to person like fever, clouding the mind. The women began hearing whispers from the soil. Not words, but memories like echoes of labor that had never stopped. In the nights they dreamed of hands pushing through the earth, reaching toward light that never came. Aunt Cora tried to keep the group steady. She told them to hold to the plan. Send word through the traders, find a preacher willing to read the ledgers, bring someone, anyone, from the outside to see. But every attempt was intercepted. One messenger never returned from the road. Another's note was found nailed to the smokehouse door, soaked in rain until the ink ran like blood. The master seemed to know without knowing. He spoke gently now, too gently, asking after each woman by name, touching shoulders, smiling in that way that meant nothing good. He ordered new lamps for the chapel and spent his nights there alone, burning incense that made the house smell of metal and sickness. Cora began to doubt her own senses. Sometimes she thought she saw movement under the floorboards, a pulse that beat in rhythm with her heart. Once, when she knelt to pray, the ground seemed to breathe back. The ledgers told a story of science, but what was happening at Bellhaven no longer felt human. It felt like the land itself had learned to keep secrets, to digest them, and still no woman ran. Not because she didn't want to, but because the earth beneath Bellhaven felt like it was listening, waiting for one more to stay behind. It was near harvest when the stranger came, dust-covered, polite, carrying a letter sealed with wax. He called himself Dr. Hollis, said he'd been sent from Charleston to inspect the health of the holdings. The master greeted him on the porch with a smile too broad to be true. For 3 days the two men spoke behind closed doors. No one heard their words, but everyone heard their laughter, thin, nervous, echoing through the house like something mechanical. Hollis walked the fields, took notes, asked questions no one had dared to ask before. How many births this year? How many deaths? Did the soil ever sour, the wells ever dry? The overseer answered with numbers, nothing more. But the doctor's eyes lingered on the women, on their exhaustion, on the strange bruises that never seemed to heal. On the 4th night he asked to see the root cellar. The master refused. Hollis smiled and said he'd come back tomorrow with the county registrar. By morning the doctor was gone. His horse remained tied to the post, its saddle slick with dew. That day the master ordered the fields burned back, the ash turned under. He told the workers that sickness had entered the soil and must be purified. The fire crept outward in slow orange sheets, devouring stalks, fences, and memory alike. The smoke hung low and black, smelling of sugar and rot. Aunt Cora knew what the fire was meant to hide. She ran to the chapel, tore up the floorboards, and found the ledgers still there, though the pages had begun to curl, ink bleeding through like veins. She wrapped them in cloth and buried them beneath the oldest oak by the road, deep enough that even fire couldn't touch them. That night, rain came sudden and violent. The flames died, but the earth steamed, and a single phrase seemed to rise from the ground itself. Nothing stays buried forever. When the rains ended, Bellhaven looked hollowed out. The fields were black glass, the fences melted into the ground. Smoke still curled from the soil days after the last ember died, twisting upward like ghosts that refused to leave. The master told everyone the fire had purified the land, but the women knew better. They could feel it. The heat hadn't destroyed the sickness. It had uncovered it. As they cleared the ruins, strange shapes appeared in the ash. Circles cut into the ground, lengths of iron that bent like ribs, fragments of glass jars fused to the earth. When the sunlight struck them, they shimmered faintly, like water at the bottom of a grave. The overseer ordered the remains buried again, but every night new pieces rose to the surface, pushed up by the breathing soil. Aunt Cora walked the fields alone after dark. She said she could hear voices coming from under the burned rows, whispers of women she'd known, their names long erased. The voices didn't ask for rescue. They asked for witness. Then came the animals. The horses refused to drink from the well. The dogs barked at the empty cellar, and even the crows circled but never landed. The master grew thinner, his eyes ringed with sleeplessness. He began spending his nights in the chapel again, muttering prayers that sounded less like devotion and more like bargaining. One morning the women found his footprints leading from the porch straight to the center of the burned field, ending abruptly in a patch of scorched clay. No one ever saw him again. The overseer claimed he'd gone north, but those who stood over that patch of earth swore they felt warmth beneath their feet, as if someone or something was still there waiting. Bellhaven had lost its master, but not its hunger. A week after the master's disappearance, 2 wagons came down the red road, county men in gray coats led by a justice from Natchez. They carried papers, seals, and the kind of authority that pretends to understand evil by writing it down. Their orders were simple: inventory Bellhaven, close the estate, and account for its owner. From the moment they stepped onto the property, the air seemed to resist them. Their boots sank deeper than the dust should allow. The house smelled of damp metal and candle smoke. The windows wept moisture, though the sun was high. They began with the study. The ledgers were gone, the desk empty. But on the wall behind a curtain they found a faint outline, a rectangle darker than the rest, as if something had been hanging there for years. The space pulsed slightly in the lamplight, breathing with the rhythm of the wind. In the fields, the investigators uncovered more anomalies. Patches where no vegetation grew, soft ground that shifted underfoot. One man struck the soil with his spade and withdrew a fragment of porcelain marked with the initials BC. He pocketed it. That night his horse threw him halfway to town. When they found him at dawn, the mark of those same letters was burned into his palm. By the third day, none of the men would enter the fields. They finished their inventory from the porch, writing in haste. Their final report read only, "Property abandoned, soil unsuitable for further cultivation." When they left, Aunt Cora watched from the oak. She knew Bellhaven would be left to rot, its name struck from maps, but she also knew the truth remained beneath, recorded not on paper but in the ground itself. Years later, when travelers passed the old road, they said the wind there smelled of iron and rain, and if you listened closely, it sounded like pages turning underground. For 20 years Bellhaven lay untouched. Vines crept through the porch boards. The roof caved in on itself. Travelers said the property hummed at night, a faint vibration that made wagon wheels rattle though no wind blew. Locals avoided the road altogether. They said the ground there didn't just remember, it summoned. Then came the speculation. The war had ended, land was cheap, and men with new fortunes looked south for soil to claim. In 1867, a merchant from Mobile, Silas Creedy, bought Bellhaven sight unseen. He sent work crews to clear the fields, promising wages and a fresh start. The workers lasted 1 week. They found the soil strangely warm, steaming even in winter. Their shovels struck objects that rang like metal but crumbled like bone. At night the ground released a faint glow, blue like gas rising from marsh water. The men refused to camp there. They said the humming grew louder when anyone spoke of digging deep. Creedy laughed at their fear and ordered the plows back into the earth. On the 7th day the oxen stopped moving. They stood in the furrows, eyes rolled white, breath slow and labored. One fell dead where it stood, its body sinking half a foot before the men could pull it free. By morning the plow lines were gone, swallowed as if the land had healed over. Creedy abandoned the property before autumn. His letters later claimed the soil moved in its sleep. He died less than a year later, found in his office clutching a clod of black earth that smelled of sugar and blood. After that, no one tried to farm Bellhaven again. Maps still marked its boundaries, but roads curved mysteriously away. The oaks grew thicker, the air quieter, and the land, patient as memory, waited for another generation to forget why it had been left alone. By the turn of the new century, Bellhaven existed only as a rumor, its name half smudged on county deeds, its coordinates blurred by cartographers who claimed their compasses failed near the old Oak Road. Then in 1903, a young historian named Eleanor Price arrived from Atlanta with a mission to document vanished plantations of the antebellum South. She believed Bellhaven would make her career. She started at the courthouse in Natchez, where the clerk handed her a box of weather-worn papers bound with rusted wire. Inside were fragments, unpaid taxes, an inventory of medical instruments, and a final entry signed E. Bellhaven. 2 words only, project concluded. The handwriting was steady, almost serene. Eleanor's research led her to old freedmen in the nearby settlements, people who still remembered the songs their mothers hummed while passing Bellhaven's road. Each melody ended the same way, 3 descending notes like a warning. When Eleanor asked what the words meant, one woman shook her head. "Not for saying, child. That's for keeping quiet." Curiosity overcame caution. Eleanor found the property after days of searching, guided by that same low hum that once unsettled travelers. The house was a skeleton of char and vine, yet the chapel stood intact, the bell missing but its frame rusted red as dried blood. Beneath the pulpit she uncovered a hollow space lined with bricks. Inside lay a bundle of rotted cloth, and within it 3 red leather books, the missing ledgers. The pages clung together, water-stained but legible. The words were precise, the tone scientific, each entry colder than the last. Eleanor read until the light failed. Then, somewhere under the floor, She heard that slow, familiar heartbeat the land had never forgotten. When she returned to town the next morning, she spoke little. Her journal that night ended with a single line. Bellhaven was not a plantation. It was a design. Eleanor Price returned to Natchez a changed woman. The locals noticed first the way she stared at the ground before speaking, how she flinched at the sound of rain. She tried to donate the ledgers to the county archive, but after one glance the curator refused to catalog them. "Those pages don't belong to time," he said. "They belong to something older," so she kept them. Night after night she transcribed by lamplight, tracing the connections between Bellhaven and other estates across the South. The pattern emerged slowly. Small notations in identical handwriting. Letters exchanged among men who called themselves custodians of inheritance. They weren't just breeding labor. They were constructing a genealogy, an unbroken line of perfected stock hidden within the wider population. The implications unsettled her. These men had merged pseudoscience and theology to justify their work. Every entry ended with the same phrase, "The soil remembers." To them the phrase was no metaphor. It was instruction. They believed the land itself could preserve bloodlines, carrying traits forward through those who tilled it. As she worked, Eleanor began to dream of the fields, their hum, their pulse, the faint blue glow. She'd wake to find her hands dusted with soil, though she hadn't left her room. The townspeople avoided her boarding house. They said the air around her smelled of burnt sugar and copper. One evening a thunderstorm struck. Witnesses later claimed the lightning hit only once, straight down the road to Bellhaven. The next morning Eleanor was gone. Her journals remained open on the table, a single line added at the bottom. The design was never abandoned. It waits in the seed. Weeks later, new crops began sprouting in the blackened fields of Bellhaven, growth too quick for any season, leaves shining with a strange blue sheen. No one went near them. The first to notice the change was a farmer named Thomas Ewell, who lived 2 miles west of Bellhaven. His mule refused to pass the property line, and when he went to investigate he saw the fields shimmering as if heat rose from them, though the morning air was cool. The soil pulsed faintly beneath his boots, like something breathing below. He knelt and touched a sprout. It was soft, waxy, almost translucent. The sap that bled from its stem wasn't green but deep red. Within weeks the growth spread. Roots reached under fences and across roads, weaving through the ditches that drained toward town. Children found small blue blossoms curling around fence posts. Dogs wouldn't approach them. One boy tried to pick a flower, and when the petals brushed his skin, he said he heard singing from the ground. The county inspector arrived with men from the agricultural office. They burned a section of the field, but by dawn, new shoots had pushed through the ash. The men reported nothing unusual in their notes, just rapid propagation of invasive flora. Yet witnesses said one of them fainted when he cut open a stalk and saw what looked like fine, braided hair inside. Soon after, families in town began experiencing strange fevers. The women, mostly young, woke in the night with bleeding noses and vivid dreams of walking barefoot through a field that glowed blue. Their husbands said they spoke in their sleep, murmuring the same 3 descending notes once sung by the women of Bellhaven long ago. The town physician suggested contaminated groundwater, but those who knew the history, who remembered the songs their mothers told them never to sing, understood. Something buried had ripened. Something that had waited for seed, rain, and remembrance had finally found them again, and it was only beginning to grow. By midsummer, the town surrounding Bellhaven had become uneasy. Windows were shuttered during the day, and no children played near the fields. The blue glow from Bellhaven's new growth pulsed at night, a quiet heartbeat visible even through fog and rain. Dogs howled in the distance, and livestock refused to graze within sight of the property. The women in town, young and old, were the first to sense it. Dreams of the old plantation crept into their sleep. Endless rows of soil, murmuring voices and the faint metallic smell of tools long buried. They awoke with the taste of iron in their mouths, their hands dirt-stained though they had touched nothing. Some claimed they could hear whispers in the wind, giving instructions they could not resist. Plant, tend, record. At the town council, men argued over the fields. Crops were growing faster than any known species. The county inspector's reports were vague, yet he refused to step near the property for more than a few minutes at a time. Those who attempted to enter reported dizziness, blurred vision, and the sensation of the ground shifting under their feet, as if it had memory and will. Eleanor Price's journals, smuggled copies kept by a distant relative, were consulted by a few brave scholars. Their margins were annotated. Observe the soil, follow the pulse, do not disturb. But curiosity could not be contained. Townsfolk who handled the journals reported hearing faint rhythmic knocks at night, originating from the pages themselves, as if the book remembered its origins in the earth beneath Bellhaven. The growth was no longer just plants. Some sprouts appeared vaguely humanoid, bending like stalks but forming limbs, faces, or faint impressions of bodies in the morning dew. The town grew silent. Its children stopped laughing. Its streets emptied. The design that Bellhaven had begun decades before was awakening in the living, not through machinery or ledger, but through the soil, the women, the dreams, and the pulse beneath the ground. What had been hidden, buried, and forgotten was now rising, and it wanted attention. In 1921, a team of anthropologists and agricultural inspectors arrived from the state university, drawn by rumors of abnormal growth and unusual soil patterns at Bellhaven. They carried notebooks, instruments, and cameras, confident that science could explain what locals only feared. But the moment their boots struck the blackened earth, something changed. The soil pulsed underfoot, faint but insistent, as if measuring their weight, their intent. Measuring rods sank deeper than expected. Compasses spun without cause. The team joked nervously, but their laughter faltered when one young researcher stumbled over a patch of earth that appeared soft, almost alive. He swore he felt fingers brushing his ankle. They descended toward the cellar remains, curious to map the old foundations. Every brick and ash-streaked board radiated a presence that pressed on the mind. One member fainted, claiming the walls whispered his name. Others reported hallucinations, glimpses of figures bending the soil like it was clay, fleeting faces pressed into tree bark, and the sensation of breathing through the ground itself. Attempts to dig were thwarted mysteriously. Shovels hit resistance that was neither root nor stone, and soil shifted beneath their hands as if alive. Equipment malfunctioned, lenses cracked spontaneously, and notebooks dissolved in the rain before any records could be kept. At night, the town around Bellhaven grew uneasy. Lights flickered in abandoned homes. The hum that had long hovered over the fields returned louder, synchronized with the pulse the women had once felt. Shadows moved independently of any source, bending and twisting as though guided by memory. When the inspectors departed, they wrote only vague reports. Topography unusual, vegetation anomalous, ground exhibits unexplained activity. No names were recorded, no journals preserved. Locals later whispered that the men had fled in terror, some never returning to their hometowns, their minds fractured by what they had glimpsed. Bellhaven had survived another attempt at exposure. Its design, carefully concealed, deeply rooted, had endured, and the pulse beneath the land, patient as memory, continued to beat. By the 1940s, the legend of Bellhaven had settled into the town like dust in the corners, half forgotten, half feared. Children were told to stay from the old road, and even adults spoke of it in whispers, careful not to disturb the memory that seemed to pulse in the soil. Yet the land's influence endured. Those who grew up near Bellhaven reported dreams filled with endless fields, hands pressing through the soil, voices repeating instructions in languages they did not know. Some inherited the knowledge of patterns, Crop rotation, soil marks, the subtle hum beneath the roots. They could feel the rhythm in their bones unacknowledged, like a faint heartbeat guiding their movement through the world. Farmers who had never stepped onto the property found themselves avoiding the area instinctively. Women in particular felt a weight in their stomachs when passing the plantation's boundaries, a lingering sense of obligation or fear. Some spoke of voices whispering at night, "Do not disturb, watch, tend, remember." Even the town's churches carried the echo, the hymns dipping unexpectedly into 3 descending notes, just as the enslaved women had once sung. Older townsfolk noted that marriages and births sometimes aligned with strange timing, children arriving at months the calendar did not predict, illnesses appearing and disappearing, a sense of fate manipulating the ordinary. Bellhaven's influence had become woven into the fabric of the community. Not overtly, not visibly, but it was there, recorded in the soil, the memory, the pulse that never left. Historians who revisited Eleanor Price's journals noticed the same pattern repeating, a cycle of disappearance, awakening, and silent control. Bellhaven's design, they realized, did not need masters to maintain it. It had become part of the landscape, part of the town itself, quietly shaping behavior, memory, and fear. And so the soil waited. Generations had come and gone, yet it remembered every whispered secret, every unspoken warning. Bellhaven was no longer just a place. It was a rhythm. It was a warning, and it had not finished teaching those who lived in its shadow. In 1948, a young anthropologist named James Whitmore arrived in Natchez, drawn by the scattered accounts of Bellhaven. He had read Eleanor Price's journals and other fragmentary records, and he believed he could document the phenomenon scientifically. His notebooks were meticulous, his instruments precise, and his curiosity unyielding. From the moment he stepped onto the old plantation road, he felt the pulse beneath his feet, faint but undeniable. The ground hummed under his boots, and shadows stretched longer than they should. Trees leaned as if listening. Birds did not fly overhead. The townspeople gave him wary glances, some crossing themselves silently, some muttering 3 descending notes under their breath. Whitmore explored the remnants of the main house and the chapel. He discovered the faint outline of the original cellar, and noted the discoloration in the soil where the fire had burned decades earlier. He documented the strange growths, the blue-tinted sprouts, and the unusual root patterns. Every measurement told him one thing. The land had been altered not by science alone, but by memory embedded into the soil itself. At night, he camped near the oak that had hidden Eleanor Price's ledgers. The soil seemed to pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat. The faint whispers came again, names, dates, instructions, repetitions of events he could not have known. When he tried to write them down, the ink blurred, the lines running together as if the land itself resisted documentation. On the 3rd night, Whitmore awoke to find the soil glowing faintly beneath him. Shapes moved under the surface, small impressions, lines, forms that recalled rows of people bending, kneeling, walking across the earth. For a moment he thought he saw the plantation workers of generations past, still trapped in their rhythms, still tending the design. By dawn, he left, notebooks incomplete, mind altered. In his reports he referred to the site only as anomalous, but privately he wrote a single line on the last page. Bellhaven is not abandoned. It is alive in memory and soil and pulse, and it waits for those who think it gone. By 1950, Bellhaven had become more legend than place, yet its pulse never ceased. Historians, anthropologists, and curious travelers came and went, recording what they could, yet the land refused full comprehension. It had become something more than memory, more than history. It was a force embedded in the soil, shaping those who approached it. Stories circulated quietly in town. A woman saw the faint glow of sprouts through the fog at night. A man awoke to a rhythmic tapping in his cellar, echoing the long-buried heartbeat. Children whispered of dreams of walking fields that weren't there in the daylight, and some who were brave enough or foolish enough to investigate returned changed, haunted by knowledge they could not share. Eleanor Price, James Whitmore, and others had recorded fragments, yet they all recognized the same truth. Bellhaven's horror was not a singular act. It was a design, carefully hidden yet persistent. Its power lay not in fire, not in exposure, not even in the decay of its master, but in the slow, inevitable imprint on human minds and soil alike. The townsfolk adapted. Roads curved away. Fields were left fallow. Songs were whispered softly as warnings rather than melodies. And still, the land hummed, a quiet warning beneath their feet. By the time the sun set over Bellhaven, there were no slaves to run, no masters to command, no overseers to patrol. Only the earth remembered. It recorded, pulsed, and waited. Every new generation carried its echoes. A hesitancy in the footsteps of women and men, a subtle rhythm in labor, a whisper in dreams. Bellhaven's legacy was not in the visible or the written. It was in memory made physical, history made tactile, and control made eternal. And for those who approached its land, knowingly or not, the pulse continued, soft, persistent, and impossible to resist. The final chapter of Bellhaven is not written in books, nor carved in stone, nor recorded in the ledgers hidden beneath the chapel floor. It is written in the rhythm beneath the earth, in the memory of soil, in the slow, inexorable pulse that continues to shape the living. By mid-century, travelers avoided the road entirely. Only birds marked the landscape, though their songs were irregular, stuttering as if the land itself dictated their rhythm. The plantation ruins, overgrown with tangled vines and strange blue-tinted sprouts, remained strangely intact, refusing decay beyond what time had already demanded. Those who approached it felt a weight in their chest, a low hum that pressed against the mind and whispered of cycles that could not be broken. The townsfolk, descendants of those who once labored at Bellhaven, carried the imprint without realizing it. They tilled fields with an instinctive caution, walked paths with unspoken awareness, and sang songs that unknowingly mirrored the three descending notes of long-forgotten warnings. No one dared speak of what they felt, yet all sensed it. The land remembered, and it judged. Historians like Eleanor Price and observers like James Whitmore had recorded fragments of the truth, but their work was incomplete. The pulse persisted, indifferent to documentation. Bellhaven had never been about a master or tools or even ledgers. It had been about control, memory embedded in earth, in lineage, in consciousness itself. And so the story ends where it began, with the soil. Beneath charred beams, beneath roots and ash, beneath the faint blue glow of new growth, the heartbeat continues. It is neither cruel nor merciful. It simply is. It waits for attention, for recognition, for the next footstep that crosses its boundary. Bellhaven survives, not in buildings, not in records, not in maps, but in pulse, memory, and the quiet, inevitable whisper that some histories cannot be escaped. And somewhere beneath the surface it waits,